sabers and spaceships and the rest. But at the same time, if you think, how did Star Wars begin? A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, which doesn't sound like science fiction. It sounds like a fairy tale, once upon a time. And there are princes and princesses. The lightsabers actually seem more like swashbuckling swords than they do like the phasers of Star Trek. So I think Star Wars itself was a really inventive and canny hybrid by George Lucas that was situated in a science fiction universe but borrowed many of the elements of fantasy. I think it'd be intriguing, and I think I've seen less of the reverse, a sort of fantasy universe that borrows elements of science fiction. I guess maybe some versions of steampunk run the closest to that. But I think in this case, the shift I'm describing from the popularity of science fiction in the 80s and 90s to fantasy today suggests a craving for a particular set of stories and a particular way of imagining the world that fantasy is particularly well suited to describe.
Could you not also argue that they are different sides of the same coin, that you need one to have the other?
Oh, I think that's really clear, and that's why, as I began to write about fantasy, I realized I don't think you can even make sense of the fantasy genre without thinking of it in the context of science fiction. In fact, before science, one other point one can make is that I think this was even in the description of my talk that Kurt posted up. I talked about how fantasy is certainly, I think, the oldest genre, because fantasy stories are rooted in really ancient myths and tales, and many of the great fantasy writers, like J.R.R. Tolkien, was himself a scholar of ancient myth. I've lost track of your question. Mm-hmm. Oh yes. So in that sense, I think there's this. In that sense, I think you could even argue, and I think some scholars do argue this, that there's this broad genre we call fantasy, or even more broadly could be called terms like speculative fiction or fabulation. That's about worlds other than the world as it really exists, rejections of realism. In literature today, we talk about magical realism. So there's this broad category of which you could talk about two specific subsets of science fiction and fantasy. You're absolutely right. They have a lot in common. And the other thing I think I'm trying to suggest is that, in a sense, I would argue science fiction often is really fantasy and drag. And even I think Star Wars is a good example. I think there's a kind of anxiety and a fear about giving in to the irrationality of fantasy, and so you deck out what are fundamentally fantasy stories with the trappings of technological justification.
How and why would people want to incorporate the shadow with everyday life? Why would we want to involve the repression?
Well, I think because there are a lot of really negative consequences to failing to do so. I mean, I think a Freudian concept that I think Jung would completely endorse is the idea of the return of the repressed, that those parts of one's psyche that one represses don't stay repressed forever. They can't simply disappear, and so they pop up in all sorts of other ways. Just as for a gay person staying in the closet, that involves a lot of pain and frustration as one tries to repress what one's actual inclinations are. There are all sorts of ways in which we repress ourselves, and I'm not, the point is not, go crazy, give in to every impulse. That's not what I suggest. But I think the most dangerous form of repression is the kind of projection that Jung in some of his writings talked about, for example, the origins of the racism of the Nazis as the projection of all of the shameful and seemingly horrible characteristics that the Nazis in Germany saw in themselves onto this scapegoat figure of the Jews, and obviously that's both bad for the Jews and as well as being obviously hateful and vile, is not a tenable strategy. I think racism in general, obviously the most immediate damage is caused to those who are the victims of racism, but I think racism and just about any other form of projection causes damage to those doing the projection or repression themselves. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I guess Kurt, you were calling people. Mm-hmm.
Fantasy has been popular, as you said, for both people, like the
I think that's an argument worth engaging and pursuing. One of the reasons that in my own work I've become interested in Jungian ideas is because I'm concerned that anti-essentialism, which was a very radical and exciting concept when it first emerged, really in the 1960s and 70s, by the 80s and 90s had become a new kind of academic dogma. The argument that everything is socially constructed, and some people have begun to ask, if everything is socially constructed, how much of an insight is it to even point out that things are socially constructed? At that point, has the concept of social construction lost all meaning? And at that point, perhaps we can begin to ask the problem is that I think the critique of essentialism is still important because there's still a lot of ways in which contemporary American ideology is full of essentialist notions that really are damaging. Feminist critics have been some of the most fierce anti-essentialists for very legitimate reasons, because our media still today is full of rhetoric about inevitable and natural differences between men and women. So-called sociobiologists make the argument that because that women are hardwired to be nurturers and take care of children because evolutionarily that was needed, while men, are naturally born to have lots of sexual partners because they want to spread their gene pool widely. And feminist critics have pointed out both the complete lack of any evidence to substantiate this, as well as the convenience of these arguments fitting so comfortably with contemporary patriarchy and sexist ideology. And have argued instead that it's important to understand the socially constructed nature of this. And if you look historically, you recognize that there have been other cultures and societies at other times that didn't have these particular stereotypes and assumptions about gender. So that's some pretty good evidence right there that it's not hardwired, but in fact is a cultural construction. So the social construction of gender, I think, is a good example of why the insights of anti-essentialism still remain valuable. But what intrigued me are new developments. For example, something I'm just beginning to read about and I'm very curious about would be Jungian approaches to cognitive psychology. Jung is really talking about something that goes on that is really about, I would describe, patterns and systems for how we make sense of the world. And Jungian language, when he talks about archetypes, the point is not that in our heads we have the little man who's the mentor and the little woman who's the old crone, another Jungian archetype. Instead, the idea is we have these ways of making sense of the world, which then become substantiated through specific archetypal images. And those archetypal images turn out differently in different cultural contexts, so that you get mentor figures like Gandalf in one set of contexts, and in other cultures you might have different kinds of mentor figures. I think Jungian perspectives have also been discredited to some extent because of some of the grand claims made by followers of Jung, such as Joseph Campbell. The argument of Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero of the Thousand Faces, is that if you look, he was a student of myth who looked at myths from all over the world and came to the conclusion that deep down they're all one single monomyth, that they're all different versions of a fundamental hero's journey, and whether the story takes place in ancient Mesopotamia or in Polynesia or any place in the globe, they're telling different versions of the same fundamental story. And subsequently, anthropologists who know the specifics of different cultures in much more detail than Campbell, who was reading widely in wide ranges of culture, said, Campbell was really shoehorning the evidence to fit his thesis, that if you look more closely, they're not all the same, and there are very substantial and distinct differences. So I think those kind of broad essentialist claims have discredited, I think, a set of Jungian ideas that, as I suggest, I think could be valuable even if we hold on to anti-essentialism, and if we look from, I think, a kind of cognitive science perspective that does not have the arrogance of the sociobiological rhetoric, it would be intriguing to take a look at that. Even today, the way film studies is mostly trying to engage cognitive science is through a kind of worship of scientific research, an idea, aha, finally the scientists can explain how movies really work. And that's not what I'm suggesting. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that Jung offers some intriguing paradigms for making sense of how our brains process information.